Hi, everyone. So my name's Dave Shpritz. I'm the Splunk practice lead at Aplura. Can everyone see the screen okay?
Yes.
Okay, cool. So today we're going to talk about what's new in Splunk 7.3, which was released the beginning of last month, I suppose. And so we're going to go through a few different things. This is kind of the markety stuff. So, well, the code name isn't markety stuff, but so Splunk 7.3 was codenamed Pinkie Pie, or is codenamed Pinkie Pie. For those of you that don't know, Splunk actually codenames their releases after My Little Ponies. So this is apparently a picture of Pinkie Pie down here in the corner. So there's some markety stuff here. There's this dark data thing that Splunk keeps talking about, which is mostly around getting more data, more of getting data into Splunk and getting more data in. There's things like the augmented reality and mobile and that kind of stuff. I'm not particularly interested in that as an administrator architect, so we're not really going to cover a whole lot of that. But what are we going to cover? So, everything okay there, Tony?
Yeah, your screen is only partially showing.
Oh.
It's like it's zoomed in.
I don't think that's
Yep, that's what we needed.
something you changed. I didn't change anything, so. Okay.
No.
Okay. So, so here are the things that we are going to cover, kind of the sections where there are new things in 7.3. There's Smart Store, searchable data rebalance, indexing improvements, search improvements, some cloud info, the search head deployer changes. That's actually some kind of neat stuff. Some changes to the indexing pipelines, metrics, workload management, token authentication, LDAP. Oh, and my screen locked. Do not do that. Okay. As well as this last piece about time fields is something that I caught kind of towards the end of reading through this stuff, and so it's kind of fun, depending on how much of a dork you are. So for me, it was pretty fun. So the first thing is Smart Store. This is kind of the big thing that a lot of people have been waiting for from Splunk. So in previous releases, Smart Store, which if you aren't familiar is the ability to store your indexes in S3 compatible storage, so not directly on your indexers or attached storage. It now supports report and data model acceleration. What that really means is that ES is now a supported thing for on-prem Smart Store, which is kind of cool. There are some more settings that were added in the GUI to aid in retention, specifically around size of the data. There's support for non-clustered indexers and indexes. So for example, if you wanted to have a standalone indexer for whatever reason using Smart Store to store your data, that's a thing you can do now. Other kind of hand-wavy things, Splunk has said better resiliency and better scalability, but not really provided a how or why around that. So it's kind of like a, when you get an update on your phone and it says bug fixes and improvements, that's pretty much all they say. So searchable data rebalance. So this was something I actually learned because it's not a thing that I have to do very often. And usually when I'm doing it, I'm expecting my environment to be poor performing and have some problems. So currently, if you would do a data rebalance inside of Splunk, the rebalance is not search safe. That is, when Splunk is going through and it's rebalancing the data and it's removing buckets, when it's removing those buckets, that can actually cause differences and inaccuracy in results. What they changed was that the workflow that Splunk goes through when it's removing the excess buckets is now search safe. And so, by the way, that's also true if you are just removing excess buckets, which is kind of a nice feature. It's a thing that I know a lot of admins have to do pretty often, especially if they have kind of flapping indexers and they can end up with a lot of excess buckets that they want to make sure they get rid of to save on some storage. There's a checkbox actually in the GUI when you go to do a data rebalance that will let you select, yes, I want it to make it searchable. Now, if you do make it searchable, one thing that you have to keep in mind is that there are certain features that are not going to be available while the rebalance is happening. Specifically, the excess bucket removal, because it's already doing that, so it's not going to let you do it again. Rolling restart of indexers, that could be kind of painful, especially if you're rebalancing a lot of data and you have a lot of data shuffling back and forth, and you also want to make some configuration changes. Then your configuration changes are going to have to wait if they're going to require a rolling restart. Rolling upgrade, also not available. I'm not particularly sure why, while you're doing data rebalance, you'd also be like, you know what I'm going to do? I'm also going to upgrade at the same time. It seems like asking for trouble, but hey, look, now you can't do it anyway. There's a timeout on this. So if you have long-running searches, so if you have searches that are going to run over the timeout period of when Splunk is going to say, okay, I'm going to hold on to this bucket until this search is complete. At a certain point, and this is configurable, Splunk will say, you know what, I'm not waiting for this thing anymore. I'm just going to go on my own. The same thing is also true on indexed real-time searches. With indexed real-time searches, you're generally talking about a smaller period of time. So those are mostly going to be newer hot buckets. But so that's really, usually it's kind of not going to really cause any problems there. But there are always going to be edge cases. So one of the things that the devs have kind of flagged is, we're not really, it's a possibility that could be a problem. Indexer clustering performance. So there are some changes in how the the cluster master displays data. So it used to be when you would go and look at the current status in the console, it would show all the intermediate changes. It turns out that doing that was actually extremely taxing on the cluster as well as the master. So now it's actually doing some caches. Additionally, we get some logging events, kind of nice for a logging product, that tell you when the replication factor, so that's RF met, the search factor, SF met, and when everything's searchable, which is nice. I don't think I've ever looked for those types of logs, but I can absolutely see them being useful. This would also mean, because of this caching, that if you're doing a rolling restart, you may see the console kind of flap a little bit more in terms of the search factor and replication factor being met. Another fun thing is the PSIDX writing level is now, they've turned it all the way up to 3. So if you're not familiar, in 7.2, they introduced the ability to set it to 2. So just kind of a quick aside on what that means. So TSIDX writing level is PowerPoint not cooperating. The TSIDX writing level is a change in the format of the way that Splunk writes buckets. So specifically the way that it's writing the TSIDX files and metadata for the bucket. What happened was that they looked at the structure that they were writing, and it hadn't been changed in a very long time. And they said, you know what, we when we originally came up with this, we added some things in here with the expectation that they'd be used in the future, and we're not really using them. And then we've got these other things that we're not really using in some weird spaces. So let's change the format and make it more efficient. According to Splunk, you actually get a pretty big performance boost off of setting that. But one thing you have to be aware of is that it has to be set on all of your indexers at the same time. There's some special guidance around if you have multi-site indexing. That's something that you have to take a look at. So certainly refer to the docs on that. Search performance. So of course, every release of Splunk, they say, oh yeah, we improved indexing and we improved search, which is of course true, but they're kind of a little bit hand wavy around how they do that. So there are a bunch of small improvements that aren't particularly highlighted here, but there are also some kind of big ones, and we'll go through these. So this is kind of a cool one. So one of the optimizations that they added in is that if you are using the stats command on a search, and Splunk determines that all of the fields that you're really concerned with are Tstatsable, so they're indexed fields, then it's under the hood going to convert those to using Tstats instead of regular stats. So that could mean a very large increase in performance. So that it's going to do this by default, but you can also disable it using the no operation or noop command. And it works with any index field. Now, the caveat there is that Splunk has to know that they're index fields. So if they are an existing metadata field, source type, host, index, underscore time, then you're cool. If it's something where Splunk knows it's an index field because it's in a fields.conf, also cool. Where you run into problems with that is that if you decide, you know what, I want to get these fields as my index field so that we can take advantage of this, I'm going to put it in fields.conf. One of the dangers there is that source type fields.conf is not source type scoped. So that means anytime you see that field, it's going to assume that it's an index time field, which may have some side effects. So that's something you definitely want to be careful about. Search performance. So we went through some of this already. So you do get large space and performance gains off of changing the PSIDX writing level. But the important thing here is that previously, when Splunk would do data model accelerations, the thing that actually wrote those data model accelerations to disk always used level 1, even if you had level 2 set on the index, or in this case, it would be level 3. It is now actually taking advantage of that setting. Some of that means that the same accelerations that you got from doing that on your normal indexes, you also get on your data model accelerations, which is kind of fun. According to some of the stats that I've seen, you should see somewhere around a 10% improvement in data model acceleration searches. Which, when you're talking about data model acceleration, you're typically talking about large amounts of data that you are doing reporting over, a large period of time. And so, 10% could be a pretty big boost. The data model UI now includes something for index constraints. So if you're not familiar with data model accelerations and creating data models, they typically the best practice is that you have index constraints in place. That is, at the front of your search, you say index equals blah. If you're familiar with the common information model and ES, that actually uses macros to implement this. And if you are using ES or you're using the common information model apps for data model accelerations, this is absolutely a thing that you should check to make sure that on your own deployment, you're using these constraints. They can have a big performance impact if they're not set. So in 7.3, if you're using the GUI, it will actually enforce that the data model has to have constraint in place. And it should be macro aware, so like the ones in the common information model. The problem is it's not perfect. So if you are writing your JSON by hand for your data models, which by the way, I don't think anyone really does, you can of course still include it in there. And the last part here is that index equals stars is kind of having an index constraint in place, so that will work. Another interesting thing, CIDR matching. So there's been some performance improvements around this. Previously, Tstats, so way back, 6.5-ish, Tstats actually wouldn't do any CIDR. Somewhere around 7.0, they added the ability to do CIDR notation in Tstats, but it would not do negated CIDR. So if you said not IP equals this, and now it does. However, and so search is also now able to do IPv6, which a lot of people have been asking for, but the caveat there is that Tstats is still not able to do that. So in 7.2, one of the things that Splunk added was the ability to use ZStandard compression, which is a compression algorithm that was developed by Facebook to store your raw data for your indexes. It's good stuff. It uses less space, less CPU usage, so you get higher performance, less disk space usage. What's not to love? In 7.2, it now uses this for journals. In in 7.3, it now actually uses this for the search results that Splunk is passing around. So if you ever look at a search head and you're looking at your artifacts, you will see a lot of gzip files. Splunk is now actually going to default to using ZStandard. For the most part, that shouldn't have a whole lot of effects on your daily life. You'll just, oh, look, performance improvements. The downside is if you're in a situation where for some reason you have to dig into one of those files, there's no kind of built-in command in most Linuxes and certainly not on Windows to decompress them. So that means you actually have to use a Splunk D command if you want to decompress them for some reason. One of the concerns here is that if you have an alert action, oh, well, I need to be able to do something with those files. Oh, something happened?
Hold on, Dave.
Yep.
Testing. Okay. I don't know what the lip was. You still there, Dave?
I'm here.
Okay.
Sweet. So if you're using alert actions, a lot of times the way that you're getting the data from Splunk D is via compressed file. Those are still going to be gzip, so you don't have to worry about having the ability to do ZStandard decompression in your alert action, which is nice because there's not currently a ZStandard decompression module in Splunk's bundled Python, which seems short-sighted to me, but I don't run Splunk. So the data model command also gets some improvements here. It now has the ability to do summaries only equals true. And so what that will allow you to do is to use what is called schema accelerated event search to pull things out of your data model. So data models have the ability now to say, look, I have these data model accelerations. They have pointers to what data is actually valid. And so now it's going to take advantage of that. So you should get some faster searches if you're using data model. Now, by default, it's going to say, okay, well, I want to get the non-accelerated and the accelerated data. But now, as with Tstats, if you've ever used that, you can tell it, you know what, I only want to use the accelerated data. This should mean that you get faster drill downs. But it is not currently available for the from command. So if you've used data models and you've done queries with them, you can use either Tstats, data models, from, or pivot. No one really uses the pivot command on purpose. You might be using the GUI and you're able to get results that way, but generally if you're actually writing a search against a data model, you're usually going to use data model from or Tstats. So now the data model command gets a nice little performance improvement. Post-process searches. So I'm actually getting bitten by this right now at a customer. They have a dashboard that is doing some post-processing, and they're having some memory issues. So in 7.3, the big change is that it used to be that if you did a post-process, that actually got run by the same Splunk D process that was delivering the original search. This meant that there was a lot of data that was kept in memory, and so you could end up running into some memory issues. So in 7.3, that execution gets a little bit smarter, and it actually uses kind of a normal search pipeline. There are some configuration options in place, and if you run into an issue where this isn't working the way that you expect it to, where your post-process searches aren't performing correctly and returning the correct results. So I don't do a lot of work with Splunk Cloud, so this is kind of, does anyone, I can kind of see the room, are there folks that are using Splunk Cloud?
Anybody? Everybody's shaking their head no.
That's awesome. I mean, yeah. So just in case you needed to know it, there's some changes to Splunk Cloud. Oh, well, one of those actually, come to think of it. So this second part here, relative search concurrency. There's the ability inside of Splunk to change around these two settings, that is max searches percent and auto summary percent. Max searches percent basically says, look, of the searches that are currently running, this number is actually available to the scheduler for scheduled searches. The second part, the auto summary percentage, says of those searches that are available to the scheduler, that this number can be, or this percentage can be used for data model accelerations or report accelerations. There's some cool stuff that you can do with these. You can actually do them based on time of day and day of week, that kind of thing. It's a nice little feature set. There are a few places where I wish they would extend that for other features inside of Splunk, but you know, if you are using the Common Information Model or ES, you should absolutely take a look at these two settings to make sure that they are not currently at the default. They should probably max searches usually around 90 or to 100%. Auto summary usually 50 to 75. It's one of the common things that we do when we're doing an ES deployment. But one of the nice things is that in 7.3, there's actually UI to do all of this work instead of having to dig out the configuration files and do them that way. How are we on time, by the way?
We're good. Good.
Okay. So this is one of the more confusing changes that I've seen. So there are now changes. How many folks are doing search head clustering?
2.
All right, cool. So in 7.3, there are changes to the way that the search head cluster deployer sends out its configs. So in previous versions, when you sent something out from the deployer, one of the things the deployer did was it took all of the configs in your apps that were in /local and it merges them into default and then sends them out to your search heads. For the most part, it causes confusion and occasionally it causes other types of problems. So there was a lot of kind of clamoring around, you know, we need to make this a little bit easier. And so we now have different ways that it will push things. So you get new flags for lookups. So you can say preserve lookups, always preserve, always overwrite, as well as how things get pushed. So you can do the merge to default, which is what we're currently used to. And then there's some other options as well. One of the nice things is that this is actually available through the app.conf configuration for an app. So if you're writing an app, you can say, you know what, this is the way that this should get pushed out from the deployer. It's nice because that if you've ever done development inside of Splunk, this is one of the places where developers have been bitten a lot. That is when they're trying to deal with search head clustering and compatibility. So a little bit more about these push modes. So merge to default, that's pretty much what we currently have. Local only, so that will only push local configs. The nice thing is that if you were in a situation where you were migrating to a search head cluster and you had things that were in local on search, in the search app, that is the search and reporting app, so the actual name of the directory is search, you pretty much had to migrate those some other way because you were not allowed to do things like deploy the search app from your deployer. You now have the ability to have a search local directory that will get pushed out correctly. One note is that this gets delivered only to the captain, and the captain will replicate those changes out. Default only, that pushes only the /default configs. Kind of nice. The nice thing is that that actually gets delivered to all nodes, not just to the captain. And then you get full. Full is no merging at all. It's just going to push default to default, local to local. So there's some kind of nice options. I haven't explored them a whole lot yet. For the record, we don't have any customers that are currently running 7.3 just because we don't live on the edge like that. So 7.3, a lot of people follow the no donuts at least with Splunk installs. So we don't have anyone who's currently has that deployed. 7.3.1 is supposed to be imminent in terms of its release. Forward-looking statement, I don't work for Splunk, so there you go. So some other nice things that were added. So you now get some metrics in your indexing pipeline. So currently, one of the things that you don't get to see is if you have multiple pipelines running on Splunk, you don't really get to see how busy they are. This could mean that you ran into situations where, you know what, I have 2 index pipelines set up, and I'm not seeing any kind of improvement here. Well, it might be because one of your pipelines is getting slammed and the other one is getting starved. So you now get these new items or entries in metrics.log, and the group is called duty cycle. That includes, a management, ingest, and miscellaneous types. These different entries will have a ratio field that says that is a measurement of busyness. And that uses some math. And I don't generally use some math. So you can certainly look at that. I believe it's documented exactly how that's being done. It's taking that from the time of start, that is the time that Splunk destarted. And so when you first start Splunk, it's going to fluctuate a while at first before it actually stabilizes to a more kind of a normalized number that, okay, this is generally how busy this thing is. So why would you need something like this other than, you know, having some good logging and a logging product? Well, because now you get to say how you want to do your pipelines set. So if you have multiple sets, pipelines set up inside of Splunk for things like your ingest, it used to be it just used round robin. So send stuff here, so send stuff here. The problem that a lot of customers ran into is that means you could have one pipeline that is just completely clogged and the other one is completely empty. So there's now a setting in server.conf that says, you know what, I'm going to change how these pipelines are set when Splunk is sending data through them. So there's now a weighted random. Weighted random is actually going to use more math as well as that ratio information. And it's going to detect or attempt to detect which pipeline is busy and then send data to the other pipeline instead. There are a lot of tunables around how you can set this. So it's if you're in a situation where you have something like a heavy forwarder that's doing a lot of API inputs of some sort like AWS, or if you have a syslog server that's doing a lot of data flowing through it, these might be something to look at if you're on 7.3. Metrics indexing. So there's now a reduced storage footprint and increased search performance on metrics. Kind of the same old you get from Splunk with any new release, right? One of the nice things here is that the metrics workspace, if you've ever worked with metrics, is now actually included inside of Splunk. So it's bundled in instead of being a separate app. It's also available via Splunk base. Now, I'm not completely clear on how that's going to play together. So that could get a little bit interesting. But, one of the things that was added to the metrics workspace is this multi-series charting, which is actually kind of nice. You can have, if you've ever used the trellis visualizations, it's a little bit like that, but each one is kind of relative to each other. So you can have better aggregation of common fields across index, or I'm sorry, yeah. So you can get better aggregation of common fields across indexes. Kind of nice. There's also better accessibility and localization in terms of if you have someone who needs accessibility because of being colorblind, for example. That's one thing that Splunk strove to improve in this release. And I believe that's across the board. It's not just in the metrics workspace. I think there are some other places in Splunk where they've tried to improve that. Metrics rollup. So if you've ever used summary indexing, it's kind of like that, but it's for metrics. So that means that you can say, look, I'm taking this measurement every 5 minutes, but typically if I'm doing long-term searching, I want to look over an hour. So you can get a speed improvement by saying, you know what, I'm going to go ahead and use the summary rollup or the metrics rollup to get just the hourly stats in there so that I can hit those a little bit faster. Another change, and I don't think I actually mentioned it here, is that there was a change to the way that licensing is done for metrics. So previously, if you were sending metrics data into Splunk, no matter what the data was, you were getting charged for, I think it's 150 bytes per metric event. That's great and all, but the problem is there are people who are sending in metric events that were way smaller than that. Well, the way that licensing now works is that if you have an event that goes in that is less than 150, you now get charged for that amount, so the smaller amount. And then if it is 150 or larger, you get charged the 150. If you're doing a lot of work with metrics, that could actually make a pretty big difference in what your licensing footprint looks like. Workload management. Anyone messing around with that at all?
Doesn't look like it.
Okay. It's kind of a nice thing. It's mostly used for Splunk Cloud. We've had some larger customers look into it. It's mostly around being able to control exactly the resources that people are using for search and for indexing. So, token authentication. So if you've ever done any work using the API for Splunk, one of the problems that everyone runs into is that, well, authentication kind of sucks. If you are using built-in Splunk authentication, you get a username and a password, cool. But if you're using something like SAML, well, you can't really do that using the API. So that's not a whole lot of fun. So you are now able to use, and so as it says here, this meant that people were doing some pretty gross things to try to get around this. So now in 7.3, you have the ability to use tokens for authentication, kind of similar to the way that AWS and a lot of other APIs do. So you were able to add this to your request from whatever you're writing, so that you are now able to authenticate against Splunk without having to deal with having a username and a password. If you're using LDAP, LDAP now has a lot of changes to it in terms of making it more performant. There have been a lot of complaints, especially around for larger enterprises where they have a lot of groups or a lot of users, where you had to be really careful with filtering those LDAP searches, or else you were going to run into performance problems when people were trying to authenticate. And occasionally you would run into problems with search and indexing as well. So there's now caching, and the caching has pages. The nice thing is there's a lot of tweaking that's available. So that's definitely something to look into configurations and documentation to see what types of things are available. And that's something that's available for both on-prem and cloud. So this should allow for very large LDAP queries. So if you're running in a very large enterprise, this might be something that you're interested in. And I believe this is actually the last slide. So time fields. So if you're familiar with the way that time fields come into Splunk, the time fields that we're specifically talking about here are these that are listed here. So date hour, date day, date minute, date month. And by the way, just so everyone's clear, that's not something that you get in all of your events, right? It depends on how that event's time was parsed. But there have been times that people have wanted to tune those and kind of when they're available and when they're not available. So you basically used to get an option of on off, but people wanted some other options. So you now have an option of off, so none or false, all, which is we're going to get all of these things, and there's a really bad joke. And then you also get an option of subseconds. Subseconds is kind of cool because that means you get none of these extra fields, but you do still get sub-second info. So, so if you're taking in a lot of data that for some reason you wanted to tune to kind of an extreme, it's something you can now do. So, and that is my pretty quick summary of how the changes that are in 7.3.